If you've been tooling leather for long at all, then at some point, this little tool right here has frustrated you beyond belief. And today, we're gonna talk about how to make this thing do what you want it to do when you want it to do it. Hello everyone, my name's Daniel Reach. This is Weaver Leather Supply. You might know me from my YouTube channel, The Leatherverse. So I've been an artist all my life, and I came into leather work thinking that I would get the basics under my belt pretty quickly. If you take a look, this is actually I think it's my second project that I ever did. I did it immediately following the first one, like literally in the same sitting. And you can see that the swivel knife work here is very shallow. It's not good, and honestly, I almost quit, and I'm not joking when I say that. Between the pear shader and the bevel and the swivel knife, I almost quit and never picked up my tools again. So whether you're brand new, you're thinking about giving up because you're so frustrated, you feel like you can't get the hang of it, or maybe you've been doing this for a little while and you feel like your swivel knife work needs some help. Well, we're going to help you with that today. We're going to show you how to level up those swivel knife skills. In fact, I'm not only going to show you, but I'm going to give you some drills that you can do that will develop the muscle memory so that you can do what you want to do without having to think about it in the moment. And that's going to take us to our first exercise, messing it up. So whether you've been in leather for a while and you just want to level up your skills a little bit, or maybe you're brand new, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do this next step. I know it's going to seem very basic, very entry level, but it's going to teach you some things that you might not have noticed in the past. And that is, I want you to get out 3 pieces of leather. One should be cased very much on the dry side, one should be just right, and the other one should be way too wet. And the way you can tell it's just right is if it takes about 1 to 2 seconds for the water to soak in. If it takes longer than that, then it's too wet. If it takes, if it soaks in immediately, then it's too dry. And what we're going to do from there is we're going to take our swivel knife, and on all 3 of them, we're going to do the same exact thing. So for the first round, let's cut too light. What happens if you go in and you don't press hard enough and you don't cut deep enough? How does it affect the 3 different types of leather? For the next one, cut way too deep. Now, don't push so hard you break your blade, but we want to go way too deep on this one because we're trying to find the limits here. You want to lean your blade right, left. So this is creating undercuts. This is not something we want to do in a project, but it's good to know what causes an undercut and what it feels like so that you can avoid that in the future. So we want cuts that are too shallow, we want cuts that are too deep, we want undercuts. So try to make as many mistakes as you can. This is the time to do that. What we're trying to do is try to figure out what causes the mistakes and how to avoid them in the future. Before we go much further, if these are the kind of videos that you like to see, give us a thumbs up. We'd very much appreciate that. That tells Weaver and it tells YouTube that we're on the right track and that we need to continue making more videos like this. It also helps it spread to other leather crafters just like you. So do me a favor, if you're enjoying the video, if you want to see more like this, give us a thumbs up. Now let's jump back in. So the first thing that you're going to want to avoid is what I call crab claw, and that's essentially where you're grabbing the blade with a fist. You've got your top finger, that index finger is just locked over the top of it. You don't really have a lot of control here with your fingers. This is going to really limit your control. What you want is for the saddle to either be on your first knuckle or just past your first knuckle on that pad. And then from there, you're gonna grip it with 3 fingers. That's gonna allow you to turn it as easily as possible. And from there, we're gonna wanna make sure that we're getting the right depth out of our cut. And for me, I wanna get about 1/3 of the way through the leather. That can be very challenging when we're talking about very, very thin leather, like a 1 or 2 ounce leather. You're probably not gonna wanna use a swivel knife on that. But if we're talking 4 or 5 and up, 1/3 of the way through the leather is a good general rule. Swiveling the knife should come from your fingers and not your wrist. You want to be able to make the turns by turning your finger and using your wrist as little as possible. What we don't want is curling your wrist to get those curves. We want to swivel the knife, and that gives us our turn. Smooth, consistent cuts are a really big deal as well. We want one smooth pull whenever possible. What we want to avoid is chopping our way through the cut. That's going to give you a very broken cut. It's really going to be very difficult to repair with your bevel, so smooth, consistent cuts. So now let's talk about tapering. When should you do it and how? Well, the easy answer is you should taper any line that doesn't intersect with another line. So if we have 2 cuts that are coming together in the center of a vine, those typically are not going to touch each other, and they're not dead ending into another flower or vine or something like that. Well, those are going to be cuts that we want to taper, but we don't want to taper all of our cuts. There's a few cuts that you're going to see that dead end into another line. Now that's not one that we want to taper. If we have two lines that come together and those lines just kind of disappear into each other or into the vine that we're cutting in, then that's going to be something you want to taper. And the easiest way to do that is about halfway through your cut, you're going to want to lighten up on the pressure of the blade and let it start lifting out of the leather. And by the time you get to the end of the cut, it shouldn't be much deeper than just a scratch at the top of the leather. Keep moving and lift your blade out and it'll taper out. In the beginning, you're going to want to make sure that you're pulling your blade towards the taper. It is possible to do a reverse cut where you start with the taper and go into a deeper cut, but that's a little bit more challenging. And if you're in the beginning and you're learning to operate a swivel knife, let's just start at the deeper end of the cut and pull towards the taper. That's going to be a lot easier for you. So what if we have a cut that's tapered on both ends? So it's tapered, deeper cut, taper. Well, there's two ways you can do it. One is that you can divide it into two cuts. It's going to be a lot more challenging to get a smooth cut like this, but it can be done. You just start in the middle, more or less, overlap your cuts a little bit and go opposite directions. Make sure you taper it out. The correct way to do it would be to start on one end with a light cut, go into a heavier cut, and then back out. That's going to give you your taper, and that's really what you want to practice, but in a pinch you can divide it into two cuts. Another don't that you want to make sure you pay attention to would be connecting your cuts. Anytime that you have two lines that intersect with each other, you want to make sure that you don't physically connect those cuts. Leave a little bit of a gap in there. You can connect those lines with your bevel, but if you connect them with your swivel knife, what happens is over time that intersection is going to create a lift and that leather is going to start to pull back, and that's something you want to avoid, especially on items that are going to be used like journal covers and belts and that kind of thing. Make sure you're keeping your blade straight up and down. As we go through a curve, we don't want to tip it because that creates an undercut. It's very rare that we want to create an undercut. So 99% of the time, you're going to want that blade straight up and down. Now, moisture content is one of the biggest factors in how your leather is going to tool. So let's talk about that for just a minute. There's wetting the leather and then there's casing the leather. Casing the leather is where we're saturating the fibers and we're giving it multiple hours, sometimes 24 to 48 hours to really let that moisture level out. And we have to be a little bit more careful with it because it's easy to oversaturate the leather when you do that. Then there's wetting the leather. Wetting the leather is done with a spray bottle or a sponge or something to that effect. That's what I do most of the time, although there are certain circumstances where I do case it and I'm wanting to maintain that moisture level for a much longer period of time. Most of the time, I'm wetting the leather. And with that, a good general rule is for me, I want it to take 1 to 2 seconds for that moisture, for that water to soak into the leather. If it's going faster than that, then that means it's too dry. If it's taking longer than that, it means that I'm reaching the saturation point and I need to back off and probably let it dry for a half hour or so just to get the moisture content back to where it needs to be. So here's a bonus tip for you. Not all cuts need to be the same depth. Some of them are going to be very, very deep that's going to create more of a lifted look. Some of them are going to be light scratches that just create texture and flow lines. So you have to decide in the moment, how deep does your cut need to be? Is it a accent cut? Is it an integral part of the design that needs more emphasis? If it's an accent cut, a lot of times you're going to go a little lighter. If it's a structural part of the design, then it's going to need to be a little deeper. But that's going to come with time. You're going to know when to do that and when not to. Let's talk about when to roll the blade versus when to pick it up and start a brand new cut. I keep using floral design as an example because in the leather world, it's probably the most universal, most common type of pattern that we work on. And in that example, you may have a situation where you have a leaf or a flower or something like that that has a scalloped edge. And if it's a nice, smooth, rolling cut, then a lot of times you can do that with a swivel knife. If it's a tightly packed cut or if it's really sharp back and forth, then that's going to be something where you need to pick up the blade and start a new cut. What we don't want to do is try to make that blade make the turn when it's too tight, because all it's going to do is chew up your leather. When in doubt, pick up the blade and start a new cut. So now let's talk about doing some swivel knife drills, the things that are going to get your hand to know how to do what you want it to do without you thinking about doing it. So the first two things that I would tell you, number one, use scrap leather. It's a great way to use up your scrap leather and not waste your good leather. And number two, what we want to do is we want to use a stylus to create the lines that we're going to follow. We want to get used to actually following a line and not just doing whatever comes to mind at the moment. The first drill that we're going to work on is simply pulling a straight line. And the focus here is going to be two things. Number one, keeping that line straight. And number two, tapering the line. We want to focus on lifting that pressure about halfway through the cut so that by the time we get to the end, we're just fading out into essentially a scratch on the top of the leather. Number two is going to be scrolls, and that's just where it rolls back and forth. Again, you want to make sure you trace in your lines with your stylus so that you know what you're following. What we don't want to do is trace in the line and then roughly follow it and it's all over the place. Really want to focus on following that line, even if it means you have to turn the leather a little bit. The third drill is what I call targeting. We're going to put a line up top and a line down bottom. I would say you need to make this at least 3 to 4 inches long. So what we're going to do is we're going to start on the top line, make sure that we finish on the bottom line, and really focus on getting that taper to start roughly halfway through the cut and finishing where we want it to finish. And then last, we're going to do deep to shallow, shallow to deep, and then shallow, deep, shallow. What we're doing here is we're practicing the different ways that we might need to taper a line. The most traditional one is going to be that deep to shallow taper. Sometimes we're going to need to reverse that. Sometimes we're going to need to come from a shallow to a deep cut. And then there's other times when we're going to need to go from shallow to deep to shallow. If you practice those 4 drills, it's going to give you a good head start on controlling your swivel knife. Now that's going to be it for this video. If you found it helpful, do us a favor and give us a thumbs up. Tells us we're on the right track. I'll see you in the next video. And in the meantime, go make something amazing.